not helpful.
Yeah, agency cultures are fascinating.
And you know it's like because some attorney like 20 years ago told them it was like a legal liability. It's just become like lore
Yeah.
since then.
Yeah.
It has like no basis.
And then they just
I think
look
we're going to
for
get
it everywhere
started.
they go.
Yeah, so thank you for coming. As I was saying to somebody earlier today, first of all, my name is Lisa O'Brien. I'm the Executive Director of Taos Housing Partnership. And it's when you have, a dinner party or some kind of gathering and you kind of get into that space of like, oh my God, what if nobody shows up? So my husband came. So when we were filling in the piece at the front about how did you learn about it, I'm like, yeah, you could, please don't put in there that it was, a hostage moment at my house. But thank you for coming. A couple things we're going to run through. This is our first live Facebook, YouTube, what do we call it?
Live stream.
Live stream, thank you. Here's me struggling because I don't know any of the new technology. And we're also taping this. So this is specifically because we were asked to do this, which again is just a wonderful place for the community to kind of give us some feedback back on what is most helpful. So just so everybody knows, we're continuing to do that work as we move in this realm of affordable housing and housing in general. Is really listening and trying to respond as best we can. So I want to acknowledge a couple partners that are in the room. First of all, in the front row, I have to acknowledge Brent Jaramillo, who is our county manager. Brent has given us the space for tonight, and Taos Housing Partnership has also had the privilege of, I have worked upstairs in the administrative wing a couple days a week. So that's, I just want to say thank you for your staff for helping us get this all set up today. And then the other partners in the back, True Kids One. So we have Pete and Amber who are on all of the technology main, I don't even know what you call them. They're running the whole show back there. This was, again, a partnership that we realized that we needed to do. It's obviously technology is not my strong suit whatsoever. So we're contracting with them, and I want to do a nod to the executive director, Sandy Campbell, who's helping us get a lot of this technology up and off the ground. We will have this video posted on our website next couple of days. And just so you know, as we kind of continue to move in this realm, that what we're hoping for is that it will be a live stream that folks are also kind of connecting with, but that also we're going to have the video for prosperity. I see that my board chair, Catherine Hummel, just walked in. I want to acknowledge Catherine. Many of you, I hope, know that Catherine is the executive director for the Dream Tree Project, an amazing asset in our community. Another one of those programs that's done some really incredible work over the last couple of years, and I just want to acknowledge Catherine for not just serving as executive director for Dream Tree, but also serving as a Taos Housing Partnership board member. I'm hoping everybody is here for the home buyer, not the home buyer, what are we here for?
Housing forecast.
A housing forecast. If you're not here for this class, you now have to stay because you've already signed in. So I'm just going to say the captive audience is here. Couple things I want to run through. This has been an amazing 24 hours, and we're going to have really a 48-hour window where there are numerous things that are happening with Taos Housing Partnership out in community. So we had a home buyer education class I'm going to talk about. We had that on Saturday. We've had a public event this morning. We have tonight. And we also have three other things coming up in the next 2 days. So I want to encourage everybody, if you have availability tomorrow night, we will be presenting to the town council at 4 o'clock. Some of the material in this PowerPoint presentation will be presented there, but there will be additional things that you can watch online from home. And then on Wednesday, we have 2 events. We're doing a nonprofit community conversation in the morning, and we are also hosting a legislative debrief where we will have Senator Gonzalez and Christina Ortez, who's our representative of the state. They will be doing a legislative debrief. Taos Housing Partnership is hosting both all of those events moving forward. So there's a lot of space in the next couple of days where you can learn everything you don't know about housing. and I will be sitting right next to you because I'm still in that learning curve. I do want to thank the Lohr Foundation. They are a private family foundation here locally. They do a lot of really cool projects and support. And the Lohr Foundation has been one of our key funding partners from the get-go. So they are sponsoring tonight and several of the other community events this week. We have this really cool board, and I just have to say, Brent, this is really fun. And Patrick, I think I might need one of these because it's this, like, it just moves through all this stuff. Here is our agenda for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those Taos Housing Partnership agency updates of where we are. I'm curious. We had funding that was ready to come in, and the IRS looks at operational dollars coming in, and if they're sort of in the queue in the background, they will expedite. So we were able to get that 501c3 determination letter a couple months ago, which is great. What that allows Taos Housing Partnership now to do is really stand up and be that organization that is now eligible to receive both public contributions. We have that charitable gift. We can say thank you for your charitable gift, and here's your tax letter. What it also does is really creates those anchor spots for us as an organization. So a couple of our other updates, and she just walked out the door, but Alexandra Goldman, here she is again, joined the Taos Housing Partnership team the middle of January. I will share with you, initially I thought I was going to hire someone who would help me with scheduling and really doing some of the handoff stuff. And within about a day and a half, I went, oh no, Alexandra needs to be let loose. And she has completely gone off into community in wonderful ways. So Alexandra comes from affordable housing work in California, the Tenderloin area specifically. And she's coming on board as our community engagement contractors, thank you. And she's handling some really just taken on projects on her own. So I'm really glad to have her and her daughter, Chloe, who's here, who I just met tonight. We've seen her on Zoom, but it's good to have her here. One of the other new cool things is we have 2 new board members. So again, nonprofits have all of these operational kind of anchor things that we have to get done. And we had 2 new board members come onto our board team the 1st of April, Dawn Singer and Jesse Hook. So they are not here tonight. They will be making their board appearances as we kind of start moving some of this forward. But just can't say enough about the development of an organization. There's so much that happens in the background that nobody sees, and yet it really is the stability for organizations moving forward. One of the things that I learned really quickly when I started, when we kind of got into the fall, was the topic of housing is so massive. And I've had these really wonderful moments of sitting in planning and zoning meetings and sitting in commission meetings and sitting in council meetings and realizing that the language and even just the words that we use around talking about housing go from one end of this side of the sidewalk all the way to the other end of the sidewalk this way. And needing to kind of harness how we're going to have conversation in community about housing got us to the spot to say we need to move on a media campaign. So those of you who are in the audience who may be an employer, if you have had specific situations where you've had either retention issues with staff, employees, or with recruitment. I'm looking at my husband who's going, oh no, not me. Please let me know, because what we're trying to do is to create the community voices that are talking about why housing matters. It's so easy for us as community members to go to the space of like, oh, we need that. And if we do this, it works. And oh, if we did that. And what I realized really fast was like, oh my goodness, complexity is like complexity. And our speakers tonight are definitely going to kind of tie into that a little bit. So this media campaign, we haven't launched it yet. We're in the working phases of it right now, where we're doing video interviews with our partners, True Kids One, and hoping to get to both a library of voices who can speak to why housing matters in this community, and two, that we'll get to what I'm anticipating to be probably a 3 to 4 to 5 minute video that'll be those snapshots. If we want strong threads in this community, and we've talked about this before, if we want a strong school system, if we want a place where the hospital and our medical providers can recruit folks to come in, housing is absolutely at every single one of those conversations. So I encourage all of you to keep coming to these meetings, because it's not as simple as we think. And the complexity is actually, and I hear voices in the background who are laughing, but it's absolutely, it's huge. Last thing I want to talk about, just in terms of updates, the county is involved in a comprehensive plan. Has anybody filled out the survey? Oh, good, a couple people. The county is engaged with a comprehensive plan review. And one of the tools that they use is a survey. And I didn't do a slide on this specifically because it's really not my information to share, but I'm going to share with some of the data on it. There were 1,100 people that filled out the survey. And a lot of folks will go, oh, that's not very many. There's 35,000 people that live in the county. And I will tell you, anyone who has done any type of community survey, community engagement, a response of 1,100 is pretty cool. It's really strong. Some of the data that came out of that on housing, and I'm just going to do some real high level stuff on it, and just so we just clear the air right off the bat. The 1,100 people who filled out that survey, 80% of them own their home, and 50% of them, here I go, 50% of them have lived in Taos for more than 20 years. And 91% of them live here full time. So we're just gonna state that fact right there. This is not folks who filled out the survey and they're only here 2 days a week, 2 days a month. These are folks who live here. They're folks who own homes here, and they're residents who live here. Of the 80% who own their homes, I thought, I'm always going like, oh, it's going to be they're not going to want affordable housing. Of the 1,100 respondents, 88% said we need affordable housing development. That means that if we just did the high level and said 1,000 people filled that out, that means that 800 people said, 880 people said we need affordable housing. That to me was like, yay! It's not such an uphill climb. The complexity stuff is, but we know what the need is in this community, and the majority of people, at least who filled out that survey, said we need it. And those are folks who live here, who've lived here for longer than a week, and they're folks who are invested in this community. So I can't say enough about this comprehensive plan process. There have been 2 visionary meetings that the county has hosted. There's one coming up in Cuesta. There's another one coming up in Penasco. I have a flyer out on the table. I encourage you, if you have not checked into what that comprehensive plan process is, please do it. This is where community input comes into play in terms of giving feedback back to our in this case, our county leaders on how they want to move forward and where we want to go as a community. So please take the time to fill that out. Do I go forwards or backwards? Where do I go? I just want to touch on our homebuyer education class. As Taos Housing Partnership, when we started this work, we knew homebuyer education was going to be one of those pivotal components. And essentially what that is, to receive or to be eligible for down payment assistance, which is one of the mortgage products that Taos Housing Partnership is kind of lining up, raising some funds, getting funds secured to offer down payment assistance. Homebuyer education is the first step to come into that. National study or statistics are about 30% of folks, a third of folks who start with a homebuyer education class, which is anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. This isn't like, you know, a 3-month tuition curriculum thing. This is an afternoon day class. We had our first class on Saturday. I was really happy. We had 11 people who showed up for that class. I learned an amazing amount of stuff. This is the course book. It's full of stuff. The homebuyer education class as a first step is also the piece that as an organization we have to be mentored. So in order to become a homebuyer education class curriculum instructor, you have to be certified, which means you have to take a test by HUD. And as a new organization, we're not at that step yet, so we have to be, actually our organization needs to be mentored. So we are partnering directly with HomeWise out of Santa Fe, and they know their stuff. So we will be rolling out additional homebuyer education classes as we get rolling. Part of what we're looking at is what the demand is. I can tell you that the folks who attended the class on Saturday, what we did a very simple survey, and what we're watching is the same thing that came out with the comprehensive plan, is that the majority of folks, there's 3 things of why folks can't get into home buying, home ownership situations. Can't afford the down payment, can't get qualified for the mortgage for some eligibility piece, or they don't have, they haven't met the requirements for, wow, the 3 things and I can't remember them.
I'm sure one of those
One
is
of
they
them.
can't find affordable homes,
Can't
right?
find affordable homes.
Yeah.
So all of these things are coming into play as we start rolling out our programmatic work now that we have our 501c3 in place. And the other piece of that is this draft affordable housing manual, which my teammate, Jen, is going to really dive into tonight. Jen, I have to say, most of you have probably seen Jen Lopez through some of our other community work over the last couple of years. Jen is absolutely an integral part of Taos Housing Partnership's team. So I say this, yes, she lives in Durango, and yes, she lives in Colorado. She knows absolutely everything you need to know about housing, and she's an asset for Taos Housing Partnership. So I can't stress enough, this isn't a situation where we say, oh, once Lisa gets up and running, Jen's gonna kind of like take a back seat. Jen is an absolute part of Taos Housing Partnership, and all of the work that we're doing in community includes her. So just so that we're kind of, every opportunity I have to kind of like set the clarity stage again, she is part of Taos Housing Partnership's team. So I think that was the last slide I had. I'm just gonna run through this one really quickly. This piece of what Taos Housing Partnership's role is, they probably should have had this blue one that's bolded on the very top. So, oh dear, I don't want this anymore. Taos Housing Partnership, Alexandra and I, and Jen, we're not a builder, and we are not a developer. So right off the bat, it's constantly saying to folks, yes, I know the urgency. Yes, I know we have a need, but do not look to Alexandra and I and Jen to be digging foundation trenches or to be that builder of houses. So tonight's presentation, I hope, is going to be that kind of fill in the blanks on how complex all of this is, because nothing happens around the work we're engaged in like that. So as much as I can ask all of you to help be the speaker to that in community, that this work is an incredible mosaic of partnership, and it's not easy and it doesn't happen fast. So these are the pieces that Taos Housing Partnership does do. We're really here to kind of help create the opportunities in our community for housing, particularly affordable housing. We're going to manage those programs like our home buyer education that I just mentioned, and this next big piece, which is to launch a second mortgage program. And that's a lot of what Jen's going to get into. And that hopefully we get to this space where Taos Housing Partnership is really seen as a best practice resource for our community governments. What I continue to see in this work is that there's limited capacity. And we just need to acknowledge that. It's not that this planning department or this government entity hasn't gotten it together to figure out how to do it. It's hard work and it takes time. And part of it is just having the time and the space and the energy to figure out what are those best practices. So that's a role that we're hopefully starting to fill in community. And then this type of stuff around community education, around affordable housing. There is so much to learn. So I thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to kind of be second cue on this one. Jen's going to kind of take things from here. And then we do have Daniel Werwath here, who is the Senior Housing Policy Advisor. Did I get it? Yeah, I've been tripping on it all week, from the governor's office. So we really wanted to kind of have this be, this is what's going on locally, and then also this is what's going on a statewide level, and this is how wonderfully complex all of this work is. So we're going to be kind of passing off mic stuff here, and hopefully we won't have any wardrobe malfunctions, and we won't have a hot mic moment. So please ask questions as we go, and thank you for coming. And don't go anywhere. How was that?
It's great. Yay.
Okay, yay.
Hello. Yay. Good to see a lot of you again. Thanks, Lisa, for the queue up. Daniel, thanks for being here. I want to go over some stuff that is happening around structuring the actual program so that when you call and say, I'm ready, we go, great, this is what we got, right? We're really close to that structure. And then I don't want to talk that much because I want to ping pong with Daniel, because it was a really big ledge session for housing. Do y'all know this? Most money ever dedicated to affordable housing this ledge session, right? And so we have the guy in the room who knows what's going to happen next with those funds. And Daniel's part of the THP family. So when I was struggling with some of these rules, because I hadn't done them in a while, I called Daniel and I'm like, what am I missing here? So you're going to have to back me up on the decisions we made back in November. So what are we going to talk about tonight? So last year we spent most of the year getting this in place, right? This is a strategy document. It says we're going to increase rental housing. We're going to start down payment assistance. We're going to, a lot of what Taos Housing Partnership is queued up to do is really facilitate partnerships and help kind of vet what projects are ready to go and not ready to go. Create some standard framework so that when the county calls and says this developer wants to do this, we now can say, here's a form with information and we can work with them, right? And kind of negotiate what are the types of housing we need, what are the price points, how do we make sure the housing is built as actually gets to the people that we care about. So those are really intense administrative processes. So that's after we passed the roadmap, we went into hibernation last winter and kind of played around with these. We wanted to come into community first because these are policies. So Taos Housing Partnership is going to take this manual to their board in the next month or two, Catherine, and you're going to adopt it. And then once you adopt it, we're going to go to the town and county and ask them to take a look at it as well. They won't always be 100% aligned, but if we had 80 to 90% alignment between processes and definitions, a lot more can happen in the community. And then once this is approved, we can start spending some money that's been sitting on the sidelines here, right? And we'll talk about those funds. So one of those funds, so Daniel, this is all your fault. Thank you so much. So Daniel calls right around the holidays. Is that okay to give you credit for this? I don't know if it was like a mafia move or what happened, but Daniel called and he's like, yeah, I'm getting ready to go to the governor's office and we got a little bit of money. Do you guys want $1 million? We're like, sure, we'll take $1 million. So the million went through governor's office to DFA to town of Taos. The scope was written a little bit aggressively, and so we had to go back to DFA, and we're going back and forth on that scope. But we're so grateful, Daniel. What a great problem to have. So $1 million came in at the beginning of January. And then the town of Taos also has a capital outlay grant of about $2.9 million. So we're sitting on $3.9 million right now that we'd like to spend. Again, we can't spend these funds until we approve the processes for doing the work. So that's why it's really important, and thank you for being here tonight. I will say that government money is really difficult, so if anybody has private dollars in this room, just let's talk, because we need both. Come on in. And government money is how we fund most affordable housing, right? And so I think New Mexico's in a really interesting place right now, and it's about to pop in terms of resources because of the governor's vision, because you're there, Daniel, and because the market is insane, right? This market is, I mean, it's not going to fix itself without some massive interventions because we're too far out of whack, right? We've underbuilt for too long. COVID put too much pressure on our markets. Land use makes it really, really difficult and, you know, frankly risky. And so we got to take these funds that are coming through the state right now and start incentivizing the developers to come in and work with us. All right. Okay, so this is, I'm going to give you the guts of a manual so you can understand what the processes will look like, who we're going to serve, would love to take questions, and then once we're done with the manual overview, we're going to have this ping pong with Daniel. So we're calling it let me see what we're calling it. We're calling it the Administrative Procedures for Affordable Housing Programs in Taos County. Probably need to rebrand that, but that's what it is. And again, it captures the processes, right? To be able to provide, because we've got the Affordable Housing Act, right? So in New Mexico, governments can't just give stuff away. They've got to go through a process, give it to projects that are deemed qualifying affordable housing projects, et cetera, et cetera. And so there has to be processes in place for some of the millions of dollars sitting at the town or at the county or wherever it is, any government level, to be able to use. You know, this is not a new conversation. Daniel, I finally looked at the Chamisa Verde files and I was like, oh my God, some of the stuff that was in those resolutions you wrote, so Daniel did the Taos plan back in 2009 and 10, called out, hey, we don't have a system here. We don't know how to give lots to builder, right? So you had called a lot of that out back then. But now we do. So, so again, once this manual gets approved, we'll be able to move much more quickly. So here, the manual talks about the purpose, the authority, it gives definitions, which is really important. I bet we all don't have the same definition of affordable housing. I bet we don't have the same definition of workforce housing. I bet we don't have the same definition of a qualified home, right? So it has all that. And then it talks about sort of who are we trying to serve, right? Very high level. And then what kind of assistance can we give them? And then what would be a qualified affordable housing project? Whether THP sponsors a project, whether the town has a project or the county has a project, this provides sort of that overlay of yep, that's a project. And then when we use public funding to provide something at below market to a community member, they can't, you have to prevent flipping and things like that. So we'll talk about that and how you preserve affordability or at least preserve the public subsidy. And then how do we get to housing agreements? All right, so we keep saying it's really complex. It is. The manual itself is only like 18 pages, but the concepts it's a lot of work to get to one of these plans. So again, we got definitions and then client eligibility, right? So eligibility falls in line with the Affordable Housing Act. So we can serve up to 120% of area median income right now because that's what your ordinances say, I think, in the town and the county. And then we know there's a gap between 120% and probably close to 200%. Go ahead. Yep.
Could you, I don't have this out there, but could you just say what is 120% of area?
I have a slide for that. Yep. And so I'll show you what those incomes are again. And if you've seen my dog and ponies in the fall, you'll see that. But we'll show you who it is. But again, we are following the primary funders of these programs, their requirements, right? Because we're not going to be able to fund this on our own, right? We got to be able to use state and federal money. What do we mean by home buyer assistance programs? So again, creating opportunities. Yes, we actually have to start building our way out of this. 10 years ago, we say, you can't build your way out. Now we're like, we got to try. We know it's an inventory issue, but it's also a financial issue. Interest rates at 7%, not helping any of us, right? So there's tools that we can both have financial products and, more reasonably, entry-level pricing. We're going to need to do it all. I think the average gap right now between what you can build in Taos and what people can afford is about $200,000. So it's a huge gap to fill. So let's see here. There we go. Here you go, Alexandra. So again, this goes up to 120%. This is household size, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Typically, home ownerships used to start at 60%, but it's really hard to hit that. That's a lot of what Habitat does, is kind of the 60 to 80. I would say we typically focus more on the 80 to 120. But you can see it's, 36,000 to almost 100,000, right? That's kind of the folks that. And then really when you create these home ownership programs, you need to make sure that your home buyers that you're preparing to either buy a home that you have sponsored or get a second mortgage, they have to qualify for a first. So that's why the home buyer education program is so critical, right? We just can't afford to create our own mortgage market too. And it's a best practice. It's sustainable home ownership, right? So you want to make sure that people get a house, they can pay their mortgages, they're underwritten the same way everybody else is written in the market. So that's what happened on class on Saturday. But here's some other, so again, we can't serve right now above 120 because of the local Affordable Housing Act policies. These are all standard underwriting. Bottom line is THP can do a few things around their policies, but we're always going to follow conventional to make sure we can access that conventional first mortgage product. Does that all make sense? Is this the right pace? Okay. And then mortgage assistance, this is such a great tool, right? It's such a great tool because it allows you to partner in different ways, do all kinds of things. When we talk about mortgage assistance, what we mean is that there would be a zero interest loan, a second mortgage, that helps meet the cash requirements for closing, reduces the principal amount of the first. It makes it more affordable through that product. It's a silent second, so you're not paying on it, right? So if I am a teacher and I can only afford $150,000 a year, and there's a house at Chamisa Verde for $200,000, THP is able to give me $50,000. It fills that gap, right? What happens to that $50,000 I get? It gets recorded as a second mortgage. It's a lien on the property. So I try to go sell it. Lisa's moved on. Alexandra, she's going to get a call from the title company. This is why we love second mortgages. They don't, there's no way to kind of not pay it back. The second mortgage or the title company will call Alexandra or Lisa and say, hey, yeah, this is paying off, right? You get the check, you put it back in your pool, you reload it. So tried and true, been working on these programs for 30 plus years. The challenge we have is how to capitalize these. So of course we'll try to go after state money, but state money is very, it's got a lot of rules and red tape. It's way easier to start this with local housing trust funds, employers, you name it. We started our first program in my community with an employer, got $1 million and went and matched it 2 to 1. But so we're still looking for the first $1 million. So if you've got that, just let me know, okay? And then again, the second mortgage can help somebody buy something if there was something in the open market. It can help somebody who just about qualifies for a subsidized home but needs a little more help. They're just so flexible. All right, so we have some developers in the room, right? And you all have, who's a developer? Who develops? Who does building? I know some of you. Good to see you. You're like, I used to, I'm not going to do it anymore. After COVID, I don't blame the folks that retired. It's really hard to do development right now. But you would say, like, well, how do we work with you, blah, blah. Well, now we know. So you can come to THP once the manual is approved, and you can say, I want to see if you can help me come up with a qualified affordable project, right? So this would include the process to ensure that, well, and part of this process is we're pricing homes, we're qualifying, and we're matching, right? So if you're a developer, we want to make sure if you're providing below market housing, that you're not sitting there trying to sell it, right? Like, we have a pipeline of buyers, we can help you sell that home, there's a process to market together. Daniel, you want to say anything? We good? Okay. Your face is great. 'Cause yeah. No, Daniel's like, did I write that or did Jen? And do I believe that still? Anyway, so again, it's a standard methodology for a builder or a developer who says, I'd be willing to offer 10 lots, or I'd be willing to, whatever it is. And it gives us a tool to talk to each other and say, okay, well, you said affordable, we mean these numbers, right? Oh, right. And you go back and forth. And then, well, if you're going to do this, because no builder or developer is going to lose profit, other than a habitat model. And so we have to offset, right? And so how do we help you offset so you can get to those prices? Daniel will talk about density all day long. That was one of our earliest examples when we were working a couple years ago. And this happens a lot for our friends in the planning department. Brent, they probably get asked this once, twice a month. So, right, because, you might be asking for water and sewer. You might be asking to be annexed into the town. You might be asking for whatever land use approval, and you may really want to help. But if there's no rules, you spin out and you walk away, right? So these are the tools that we'll use for all of that. And then again, this is just how it works, but the housing subsidy, we may have a range where, I wish we were only giving away $10,000 to make the people buy a home. I think it's going to be much higher than that. But let's just say maybe at the very top end, people just need $10,000. They may need up to $100,000 of subsidy, right? We don't know yet. We're still working through the highest end of the loan amounts, and it's going to be a lot dependent on how much money we have, right? So the more money we can raise, the more diversity in loan amounts we can do, the more we can stack things. But whatever happens, we're going to make sure that that loan gets paid back. One of the other premises is that if we end up putting a lot of subsidy into homes, like let's say, I'm going to keep going to Chamizo Verde. Like, let's say something gets built there, and it costs $400 to build it, and we're going to sell it at $250. That's a huge discount. We may be looking at a shared appreciation model for the second mortgage, which I won't get into now. But the point in all of that is nobody's going to get a windfall from buying one of these homes, and we're not going to lose those subsidies unless there's a foreclosure, which programs that have home buyer education and all this oversight, 2% rate, they have almost no foreclosures because of all the preparation for households. So if you were a developer and you wanted to figure this out, you would call Lisa and you'd say, I want to talk to you and Jen about helping me create an affordable housing proposal. It's a form. We walk through it with you. This is not going to be like a one call. This could take months for us to figure out, because one of the things we're going to be trying to solve for is what do we have control of versus MFA or land use, right? And so we don't want to create an agreement where you need a bunch of things from other third parties and they don't happen, then you can't deliver. So we're trying to, streamline a couple of tools, figure it out, because again, if it gets too complicated, it doesn't happen, it dies, people get frustrated. So let's say we get this agreement figured out and we think we're pretty solid on it, then it will either depend on whether THP is working on fundraising for your project directly or if it's with the town. But we would take that proposal and turn it into some kind of agreement, right? A legal binding agreement. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. That was quick. The handoff. So if you have questions, we just wanted to give you a heads up on this manual. Again, it'll go to the THP board probably in the next month or two. We're going to introduce some concepts tomorrow night at Town Council, but this is it, right? These are the rules we've been trying to figure out. So thank you for your patience. Daniel, what's going on? And no, you got it.
I've got it.
Cool.
Can you guys hear me okay on the mic?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Great. So again, Daniel Werwath, I work for the governor's office, housing policy advisor, been doing work in New Mexico for the last 20 or so years on housing, affordable housing development, strategic plans. As Jen mentioned, I worked on the 2009 Town of Taos Strategic Housing Plan. And yeah, I'm mostly here. I had the great opportunity to work with Taos Housing Partnership in the development of programs over the last year. before I transitioned to the governor's office. So I bring both a lot of local knowledge, but mostly here to talk about what we're doing at the state level around housing. And I can say, just 3 months into my job at the governor's office, that housing is a top priority for the governor. A part of a series of initiatives that she's really focused on that are everyday issues affecting families. Things like education, things like healthcare, things like housing, these basics that she really feels we should be good at government first. And so is really leading in that area. So the biggest goal, so I got into this because I served on a task force for the governor over the last 9 months called the Community Investment and Revitalization Council. And we came up with some recommendations that turned into legislation. And then the governor's office said, it'd be great if you would join us and help us try and get this passed. So I started this job the day before the legislative session, which is maybe one of the most insane things I've done in a long career of making very insane choices or taking on very challenging projects. But we were really successful for the most part. The legislation passed included 2 law changes, one creating some new funding, both creating new funding sources for housing, along with record investments in housing, just shy of $200 million, which brings our total investment in housing this year north of $250 million, which is pretty much a 10-fold increase almost of any previous year's funding. So clearly it's a priority, and I'll go into the details on that. We did attempt to create an Office of Housing. You may or may not know the state of New Mexico does not have a housing agency in government. One of 8 states that does not do that. In the 90s, the responsibilities of the State Office of Housing were sort of delegated to our State Housing Finance Authority, the Mortgage Finance Authority. They're essentially, they run most of the affordable housing programs for the state. And from our point of view, they do very good at project-by-project affordable housing programs and administering programs, but they don't really have the purview to, one, organize the housing response within state government. There's about 12 different agencies that have housing programs, from CYFD to CID, who you've probably heard of. And the other piece is that there's no one looking at the really big picture of this. What are the levers we can pull to bring down housing cost, increase access to housing, right? When you're working at a project-based level, you're not thinking about workforce. You're not thinking about land use and regulatory frameworks. You're not thinking about intergovernmental and regional collaborations to bring capacity. And probably the biggest thing that we really hope to create with the Office of Housing is sort of a statewide strategic plan that's really focused on helping local governments meet their needs, particularly in the capacity area, whether it be around land use or program development. Just watching the process here, like very lucky alignment of politics and community support and financial support, but that's not the case in every community. And so every community I've visited probably a dozen communities since I started this job 3 months ago. Every single one says, we want to do housing, we don't know how, we don't know where to start, right? So really assisting local governments to do that work we see as a really key piece. Now, unfortunately, that did not pass, largely because there's a common feeling that, like, we have a housing quasi-governmental agency, why would we need this state agency? And so the governor snuck a couple $1 million into her budget and said, go do it anyway. So we don't have statutory authority, but so that doesn't really matter that much because the work's the same, and so we're out here doing it. The really interesting thing, so there are now 3 new housing funding sources, or at least 2 new and 1 existing. I'll run through all the 200 and some odd million funding. So the governor also, in her budget, set aside $20 million to come up with unique strategies to address the unhoused population around New Mexico. And so that money is going to be prioritized probably around case management and behavioral health services, not so much on the housing side of it. And so we're going to look to innovative models that can supplement the existing approaches and also lift up individual approaches that are maybe innovative or working outside the current models. The idea behind that is that if we can serve the really hardest to serve homeless populations, we're going to free up a ton of resources, whether it's from the existing federal homeless intervention programs and also the burdens on local governments, public safety and healthcare resources. So it's a high ROI investment from the government point of view. Sort of moving up an income tier, the next segment is the State Housing Trust Fund. This is a sub-state trust fund that's a subsidy program. It's used to create income-restricted affordable housing. It's managed by the Mortgage Finance Authority. Last year, we took a really great step and created a reoccurring allocation to that fund for the first time ever, and it's a portion of the severance tax bonds, which are the bonds that are issued based on the revenue from oil and gas. And that this year is going to generate $50 million for that fund. And then they did one-time discretionary funds of another $50 million. So the Mortgage Finance Authority this year has $100 million of trust funds to add into all the other federal programs and all the other things they do. So they do a mix of down payment assistance with that money. They support rental housing, affordable rental housing projects, typically tax credit projects. So they add in funding to meet gaps, or they extend the affordability deeper into the income ranges than the federal programs might otherwise. And then obviously I think we're working really hard to push for bigger investments in single-family home ownership. That is just such a big return on investment for both communities, but also in terms of fixing people's housing costs long-term, reversing systemic inequities and access to wealth and housing. So it's a really high ROI thing. So, but that would be for traditional income-restricted housing below 120% of median income. The newest funding source is actually going to be at the New Mexico Finance Authority. It doesn't help the confusion of affordable housing that everything's named one word apart from everything else. But the New Mexico Finance Authority has a new workforce housing fund. And this is one of the really unique things, one of the things that came out of the work on the Housing Investment Council that I served on. And the idea behind this is a flexible funding mechanism for the construction of workforce housing, which the state is defining as housing serving people who make too much money for traditional affordable housing programs, but still have a gap in the market to where they can't afford housing, right? And the challenge with all of these is I can't say with any certainty exactly how these will be deployed because they're in rulemaking processes right now. So MFA is under the process of deciding how it will allocate their $100 million from the trust fund. That will be at their board meeting, third Wednesday, 9:30 a.m., 4th Street, Albuquerque, if anyone wants to go. And then the Opportunity Enterprise Revolving Fund, that's the workforce housing funding mechanism. It's going to work different than our traditional affordable housing programs. The idea is this is construction finance mostly. So shorter term money that turns over quickly, but it will have very aggressive terms. It can fund things that banks won't fund. So think early stage infrastructure that unlocks a large piece of land, or can have no payments for 2 years until infrastructure is built out and you can start selling houses. So a lot more flexible funding. And the idea there is that it's going to serve. All it has to do is come in at prices affordable to those folks that don't have options in the market currently. So that's going to go through a 3-step rulemaking process. So there's rulemaking that's going to start May 1st with the New Mexico Finance Authority. Then they will develop policies. These rulemaking processes are public because of state law. And then there's going to be a secondary rulemaking process around the financing mechanisms and how those are structured. So they sort of break out, how do we prioritize projects? How do we structure the funding so that it is beneficial to developers and actually leverages lower cost housing than what we have now? And then one last one for nonprofit developers. There is a funding source called the Public Project Revolving Fund, the PPRF at the New Mexico Finance Authority. That was just through statute expanded to nonprofit housing developers. So if, say, THP wanted to undertake a housing project, you could actually apply to that fund, which is typically restricted to infrastructure for local governments. So it's been expanded out from the local government range. So we've brought a bunch of financing tools to the table. We haven't totally figured out how they are going to work yet because of the rulemaking processes. We expect that MFA will probably approve and have new rules rolled out for the Housing Trust Fund at the start of the state's fiscal year, which is in July 1. And then the New Mexico Finance Authority, the Opportunity Enterprise Revolving Fund, which is overseen by a board within the Finance Authority, that should roll out. My guess would be applications towards the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. So that's sort of the timeline. So this is the landscape. We have a lot of money flooding into housing. And I think the challenge is that we use it right. We get the projects in place. The facilitation on the local level is a big deal. Get the projects in place that are near shovel ready because there are a lot of funding sources coming down. And then in the meantime, our NOT Office of Housing will be working on the bigger picture. How do we bring more workforce to the construction industries to help bring down costs? How do we work with local governments to improve their land use and zoning? Working with the city of Santa Fe right now to do a huge incentive package for workforce and affordable housing, right? Everyone thinks about land use as a tool to separate uses that might not be harmonious or to affect how things look. But it's also a powerful tool that points the market to what they do, right? And Jen mentioned my forever soapbox about housing density, right? The traditional density of housing in New Mexico is a lot more like Taos Pueblo than it is like Blueberry Hill. But we have in our minds that post-World War II subdivision development is somehow historic, but it's not. And it's not really good for affordability. It's not good for infrastructure and infrastructure liability, right? Developers build infrastructure, but you as taxpayers own it and maintain it. So no one really thinks, are we building dense enough to generate enough tax revenue to pay for these roads, to pay for this sewer, to pay for those water lines that we now own? This is a big thing that nobody thinks about in the framework of, and then there's sprawl. There's climate change, there's more water use, there's more car use, right? So density and climate change overlap. Density is so much a part of land use and zoning. Often it's hard to get to higher densities in our current development framework, but I like to use the example like, I don't know the stats offhand for Taos, but like in Santa Fe, about 52% of the residential land is zoned 1 unit per acre, right? And so under that framework, a developer gets a piece of land and your incentive is to build the biggest, most expensive house possible because you have one piece of expensive land. Now, if you flip that and said, we can build 8 units on that, the incentive then becomes how many units can I fit on this piece of land? That's the way to maximize profit. And it changes the incentive for the private sector, right? And because you're spreading out land costs, infrastructure costs, all your fixed costs, right? You lower the floor on cost. And then because there's more units, they're naturally smaller and naturally more affordable, right? And so that's good for housing, that's good for tax base, that's good for climate, that's good for urban fabric, it's good for neighborhood amenities that mean that people don't have to drive everywhere. So really a framework we have to start thinking more about, moving away from those post-World War II subdivision sprawl. And also in a place like Taos, right? Like, I mean, New Mexico can keep growing out, but should we? I mean, it's like really thinking about what are the things we love about our landscapes and at what point are we defending our immediate environment in exchange for ruining the larger landscape through sprawl. So that's a big piece of what we're thinking about from the governor's office. How do we support local governments in educating themselves about these frameworks? A lot of local governments don't have the staff capacity to do that, so looking at the ways that we can support through best practice legislation, model documents, programs, things like that, and then technical assistance to help implement this stuff. The other big thing I'm doing is just traveling all over the state and listening to what communities need around housing and understanding what the opportunities are, and then figuring out what I need to go back to the governor and the legislature with for the 60-day session. The governor has 2 years, 7 months left, and then she is termed out. This upcoming 60-day legislative session, for those of you who don't know, we have a very strange system of 60 days one year, 30 days the next year. You literally can barely get anything done in the 30-day session. She has one 60-day session left, and that is this coming year. So we're working really hard to come in with a very big suite of proposals to try and make some big structural changes in how we approach housing in New Mexico. I think that's about it. Any questions?
So the density, does that require then a zoning change, or because zoning changes are a big deal? So is that incentive circumventing the need for zoning change?
So that's a great point.
Hey, Daniel,
Yeah.
can you repeat the question?
Oh, so people can hear it. Yeah. Joaquin is asking about whether or not an incentive for denser housing would supersede local zoning. Let me get my water because I'm about to run out of voice. Cottonwoods, I swear to God. So in this case, like the only incentive thing we're working on right now is with the city of Santa Fe as a model, and it would circumvent their own zoning and say, if you're doing affordable housing, you don't need a rezone up to a certain density. The scale of project that would require a development plan would grow. As long as you're doing a community benefit project, streamline land use approvals, and you couldn't deny a project unless it was based on the performative aspects of the land use code, unless it was like violating a land use code provision. What we're looking at, and what I have not actually pitched this yet, but are sort of feeling out the idea of creating some statewide land use legislation to go in front of the legislature next year. The idea of maybe convening a working group of folks, different stakeholders from around the state, to work on what are some best practices that we could do statewide. And there's lots of options. I've been doing a ton of research. One of the priorities of the Opportunity Enterprise Revolving Fund is it's going to prioritize projects in communities that are implementing zoning, land use and zoning reforms. So we're trying to use that funding as a carrot to get local governments to start implementing some of these changes. But we may also need some guardrails, right? Like Santa Fe's zoning code's 23 years old, right? Almost every project that goes through there has to go through a rezone. And it's just clearly so maybe we need to look at having standards for how often cities need to update their zoning code. We may not need to do that statutorily. We can say if you want capital outlay, you have to have zoning that's less than 5 years old. Some things like that. There's also some things that we could look at statewide, like guest houses. That's been really popular in other states, making guest houses, preempting local zoning on guest houses. ADUs, yep, same idea. Yeah, casitas. What's that?
How do you define guest house?
Lots of different communities define it different ways. But if you were going to do it statewide, you would have to decide. I'm not saying we're doing this. I'm giving examples of the type of legislation that they've done in other states statewide to try and create more opportunities for housing. Transit-oriented development's another really big one. If you have a piece of land that's in a certain radius of a transit stop, that it would have a default denser zoning and supersede local zoning. That's been done in several states. On the more aggressive end of things that I don't know would really be compatible with New Mexico are things like preempting single-family zoning, right? And saying you can't prohibit duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in single-family neighborhoods. I don't know, because of the way New Mexico is so diverse and because of the capacity issues, to me, I think the approach is probably better around we need some broad guardrails around land use and maybe some particular areas of statewide zoning that would be helpful, but then really use funding as an incentive and technical assistance to get local governments to choose how to comply with mandates to increase housing access. Not unlike what they've done in Colorado with Prop 123, which is a giant housing funding source that's tied to goal making. That's the other thing. Does anyone know offhand what Taos's goal for affordable housing is right now?
I don't think they have.
Neither does anybody else, right? And the number one thing you want to do when you try and solve a big complex problem like this, you need to set goals. You need to create assessment frameworks. You need to track data, and you need to look at what works. Because every community is different. And in the best case, like I think Taos Housing Partnership and the town and county are doing here, is they're trying a diversity of strategies, right? And they're not all going to work the same in the same communities, and you've got to track them, and you got to make sure that you're funding things that work. Yeah.
What are ADUs?
Accessory dwelling units, which is the technical term for something you probably would call a casita. Yeah. But it can also be a Fonzie flat. That's what you call them when they're above a garage.
I haven't heard anything yet about utility bills,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a really important component of creating a building that is affordable.
Right.
And so what a lot of designers and builders and developers here in Taos is we build completely sustainable off-grid buildings
Sure.
that do it all with no fossil fuels. And so
Mm-hmm.
my question is what would it look like for a development of, say, 200 units on, really dense, on something like 10 acres, completely off-grid, and how would that fit into the into the zoning? How would that work? Because the design is there, the building is there,
Yeah.
but the zoning, that seems to be the biggest issue for getting something like that on that level.
Certainly, it would matter a lot what jurisdiction you were in,
Taos
right?
County.
Taos County. I mean, and you have the statewide experimental zoning, but that probably, I don't know enough about the specifics of either the county zoning or the statewide rules on this. I mean, I think, there's certainly a priority of building housing near services, right? Which, and to me, like, off-grid housing is really great and it solves specific problems. It seems to have arisen in Taos County out of a lack of infrastructure, not, it's a reaction to a problem, which is a lack of public investment in infrastructure. I think they're great strategies, and I think there's nothing that would preclude them from being supported by state funding sources and things like that. On the utility bill side, absolutely really focused on that. We did Green Code statewide. We just announced today a $150 million EPA grant for low-income solar. That we're one of a handful of pilot communities around the country that won this grant from EPA. So we're going to have, over the next few months, rollouts around that. There's a ton of money flowing down from the federal government in the IRA that is going to support the Inflation Reduction Act, that's going to support energy retrofits, tax credits for going to mini splits. I'm trying to think what else is in there. There's a ton of incentives about to flow down from the state and federal level around making sure that housing's not just affordable to buy or rent, but also to operate, right? Because that's something that we've been in the nonprofit development community concerned with from the beginning in terms of the overall. The operating costs, a cheap house with high operating costs isn't affordable, right?
What's EPA solar?
What's that?
What is EPA solar? What is that?
The Environmental Protection Agency, the federal EPA. They're the.
Asking what the program was.
Oh, it is called. I can't remember the name of the grant program off the top of my head, but I can send you the info.
It's a grant program.
Right, to low-income homeowners and renters. Yep, so existing affordable rental housing and existing lower-income homeowners.
Will that go through MFA, do you think?
I think it's going to go through MNERD, the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yep.
And
But
not
we'll,
the weatherization program,
what's that?
separate from the weatherization programs?
Yep. So this is going to be an addition. This is going to be like a standalone solar option. Yeah.
So just to piggyback on that too.
Sure.
There's 20 million for creating the housing, or you mentioned some big budget.
Yeah.
Is there any of the funds being used to support or evaluate different programs to promote initiatives for future building programs to include all kind of off-grid, solar water recycling systems and
Not-
communities?
Yeah, and not specifically, because as with any entity as large as the state, we sort of break these things out into different places. One of the huge challenges we have is that not having a housing agency means there's no one thinking about that thread across government. So we have sustainability programs at the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, right, that aren't talking to other departments in the state. There's no coordination across that. And that's one of the goals that we're trying to create, is more coordination across those programs, because they can leverage each other, and you want to make sure that they're working together, right? But yeah, I mean, I think sustainability, I've been already digging into this, and I started digging into the state's greenhouse gas plans. They say that residential structures in New Mexico only contribute 3% of the carbon emissions in the state, because they only look at the fossil fuels burned in the house. So your stove, your hot water heater, your furnace. But
they don't consider wood stoves either.
right, and they also don't look at how much you drive, because there's not housing where your job is, right? And that's like the next step that we have to go to, is thinking out that level. We have a very unit-based idea of efficiency that doesn't look at locational efficiency. It does not, because they couldn't even begin to quantify that. When I was like, do you know how much transportation GHGs are being generated because 30,000 people drive to Santa Fe every day for work, and 8,000 people drive from Santa Fe to Los Alamos every day for work? So it's on the docket of what we're trying to work on, but it's not specifically as part of these funding initiatives. But that's really what the idea of an Office of Housing would do, is that would be our job. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
I just wanted to connect that point is, we've been doing sustainable off-grid buildings for 50 years, and it's not so much about pollution or being environmentalists.
Mm-hmm.
It's logical, and so when someone is in a house that they can afford the mortgage or the rent, hopefully
Yeah.
it's 1,000 or less, but when they're in a building that takes care of them, that they don't have to have utility bills,
Right.
that's a fundamental shift in when they're dealing with such a tight budget.
Yep.
And they're in a home that takes care of them, and it actually makes them, how can I say this, less stress and more comfortable to hit the mortgage.
Right.
So it makes a huge difference
Yeah.
in people being able to afford the building, right?
Agreed.
So it's just a really, really critical thing that has to be included all the way through on affordable housing, is that they
Yeah.
have to be as sustainable as possible, not for the planet, for the budget.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Because also with that comment, so Taos made ABC News today as it's Earth Day, and the Earthship community was actually featured in their promotion of sustainability.
Yep.
And even the costs that are used for building materials and the environmental impact for the materials. And so in any of this legislation or funding, is there anything that is promoting these types of buildings? For whether it's like promoting homeowner builds, using natural materials, as we understand the Taos Pueblo is 1,000 years old, adobe structures.
Sure.
So, just a backhoe can come
Yeah,
with
so-
land. So how do we?
Yeah, and honestly, like, we don't layer a lot of those things into the funding sources, because they're hard enough to get past as they are, and if you start adding things into them. But we have an underpinning framework of that. The Mortgage Finance Authority has green building guidelines that have a minimum HERS standard for efficiency. We'd love to see them go further and say that things like net zero energy get extra points, right? So off-grid or grid-tied net zero housing. I built a net zero energy project. I'm a huge fan of all that stuff. There's nothing that precludes it in any of this, right? And I think in the framework of these things, the challenge has always been with off-grid is getting them financed, right? And I don't know where mortgages are at with them right now, but last I checked, you have to have some redundant systems to be able to get a traditional mortgage, like a regular bank mortgage? No?
No, it's straightforward and easy.
So great, and then it's just scalability, right? Like they're incredibly labor intensive, and so they can't be deployed as quickly as other types of housing, right? When we look at, say, production building, subdivision development. So like I said, I don't think there's anything that precludes them being included in this, and I understand the excitement and especially the pride in Taos of being sort of the birthplace of this. I've gotten to stay in several Earthships over the years, have all of Mike Reynolds' books. I'm very familiar with it. But yeah, we don't really get that micro with this stuff. And when you work statewide, you can't get that micro with stuff because it will die in the legislature if you start getting really specific. Or frankly, if you hamstring stuff, right, where you can't use funding because you're not doing X, it's not a best practice in terms of housing funding. We want the housing funding to be as flexible as possible. There's nothing precluding it being used for things like Earthships, but at the same time, we don't want to stop an area from getting funded because they can only get mobile homes, right? Which is a whole other thing that I would put on people's radar. I don't know if you guys follow this, but manufacturer housing rules have just changed. Higher levels of energy efficiency. Clayton Homes in Albuquerque is now building a net zero energy ready mobile home, 100% electric. And up to 3 unit are now legal under the HUD Manufactured Housing Code. So lots of stuff happening all over. And I think the solution in my world, the solution has to be a lot of different things. It has to be things like Earthships. It has to be higher quality manufactured housing that comes with good financing. It has to be really high quality stick-built homes, high quality Adobe homes, with the idea being that at the end of the day, what we really need is a lot of different housing meeting the different needs around the state, because the needs in Deming are really different from the needs here. But our job at my level is to be keeping all those held at the same time, right? And the capacities are different, right? We'd love to see growing local development capacity. That's a really big thing from my office that we're focused on from the workforce side. So not just how do we get people going into the trades, how do we get CTE programs at high schools focused on that, which we are working on. We did create a workforce apprenticeship fund this year. It's a permanent fund that's going to double the amount of money going into apprenticeship programs statewide. But also thinking about how do we get the framer to be a contractor, the contractor to be a production builder, right? Like how do you lower the risk for people to grow their capacity? I would love to see like a lot of new housing built by locals for locals, right? That's the best housing, is when it's comes from the community where it's being built.
You said the solution involved a number of things, and both the director of THP spoke of complexity, saying, quote, complexity, it's huge, end quote. And the Moxie CEO also said that it's, quote, we keep saying it's really complex, and it really is, end quote. And the director, the CEO of Moxie also spoke about needing to incentivize developers, end quote. The market is crazy, end quote. So what if we change the system, and instead of having all of this complexity, we simply have a tax policy, tax regimen, tax legislation that taxed wealth, and was able to provide governments, local governments, with the money needed to build local housing for the communities. So in the long run, if we were focused on tax policies, maybe we would eliminate the problems of complexity along the way if we go after the money that we need to build the communities that we want to build.
Could you repeat?
Yeah, that's going to be really hard, but I can synopsize, and
Essentially, I'll tell you what.
No, do they want to do it for the microphone for the live stream, right? So the gentleman asked, essentially, why don't, like, we keep raising the issue of complexity. Why don't we just tax the rich? Is that a, like, fair?
Tax wealth.
Yeah, tax wealth. Because frankly, money alone doesn't fix the problem. I mean, whatever you think about tax policy, you know, that your approach hasn't really been popular for the last 40-something years. But And it's certainly one of the challenges. We haven't had enough funding for housing. Prior to last year's $30-something million allocation to the state's Housing Trust Fund, I think we were in single-digit millions on housing. So disinvestment in housing is absolutely one of the challenges. I think all the money in the world doesn't fix land use and zoning complexity. The fact that we use a public system to approve the building of new housing permits and a private system for the building of new housing, it's like, it's one of the most complex systems you could ever imagine. There's so many factors: financing, materials construction, labor availability, and money doesn't fix those problems. And so to me, it's a both. You've got to do both. You've got to find funding, and you could do funding in your local community. There's tools out there, there's funding sources. That's something that our office can help with, is exploring those options. Santa Fe just passed a high-end home tax that's going to generate $4 to $9 million a year for their housing trust fund. Well, what's that?
It's in the courts.
It is in the courts, yeah.
Not to interrupt, but I understand that. I don't mean to suggest that wealth alone is going to solve the problem. I'm familiar with land use, zoning, and regulations. I taught in graduate school. Listen to the
Oh yeah, and
conversation.
then I don't mean to imply that you don't.
Listen to the conversation, and I understand that it's a great deal more complex than simply wealth. But if we start with the understanding that we're going to provide for the needs of the community, then it seems to me, if that's our goal, that we can deal with land use and all those other things.
Right. I would say that that sounds like a really important conversation about community values that needs to be had, right? How you choose to fund things like housing in your community isn't something I can tell you. I can tell you the different ways that other communities have done it, but it's really a community values conversation that determines the right way to do that in your community. You could issue a bond for housing tomorrow. You know, that would be based on property taxes, and it would tax wealthier properties more than cheaper properties, right? You could do that tomorrow. There are more aggressive things like the transfer tax they did in Santa Fe that targets homes over $1 million. And so specifically targeted at only impacting a certain cost of house. I think those are important things, and having local funding is one of the most important things. As Jen was saying, the federal funds are so hard to use. State funds are a little better. Local funds are the best, right? In terms of how easy they are to manage, what they can do. The barriers you can create are very low to deploying that funding. And you can get a lot of impact. A little bit of local money goes a long way in terms of leveraging those other sources, right? The catalytic money that buys the piece of land that then wins a tax credit award or gets a state grant or a federal grant.
No, I'm just saying we've got. We got 5 minutes left. We're going to honor the time together. So, I always learn a lot hearing the questions about your community and about the state stuff. Maybe one more question before we go, or did we get them mostly?
What's the second shared appreciation?
It's oh boy. And
You want me?
Yes, please. Yeah. It was.
So it's part of the framework of
what is it? He asked, what is a
Yeah.
shared appreciation second mortgage, which is a
Right.
tool we use. Go ahead.
So way to think about a shared appreciation second mortgage. So Jen talked about simple second mortgages, which are zero interest mortgages, where you just pay back what you were given. It's like sort of like having a rich uncle that helps you buy a house, and it's just like down the road, pay the money back. There, you don't owe anymore. So a shared appreciation mortgage is the same model, but it looks at the increase in value of the home over time. And say let's use really round numbers. A $200,000 house, you got a $100,000 discount. You got that house for $100,000. You go to sell, it's worth $300,000. The increase in value gets split between either the public entity or the nonprofit that gave the assistance and the buyer. So you would each get $50,000 in the increase in value. And it's one way to help keep resources growing for affordable housing. And it helps you do things like exercise a right of first refusal. Like a lot of these mortgages would have a right of first refusal that if you put a big subsidy into a house or you discounted a house really significantly, if you were going to sell it, it would give the local government or the Taos Housing Partnership the right to buy that house back and make it affordable for another buyer, right? It's a tool. And so it's easier to do when you have shared appreciation because you actually not just get your $100,000 back, you get a little bit of the increase in value, which can help re-subsidize it. Now the downside is that lowers the wealth creation potential. Now typically with homebuyer programs, one of the big focuses is actually creating wealth with people who have no other opportunities for creating wealth or who have systematically been denied access to wealth because of things like redlining or access to capital or land use and zoning, exclusionary zoning policies. So it's really, again, one of those community values conversations. Is our program more about creating affordable housing that's affordable forever versus really focusing on wealth building for lower income families that actually has like a long-term multi-generational effect and can actually help someone transition out of needing programs, right, for housing.
Just to jump on that at the end of it, you were talking about creating wealth and building home ownership. The CEO for Moxie said almost at the beginning of her discussion, quote, "We're going to create rental housing." Quote. So where does rental housing come in this model?
Let me do this one.
Take it.
So every community, you want to have housing across that continuum. The most popular program to create rental housing in this country is using tax credits. It doesn't solve everything, it doesn't fix everything, but it does serve a spectrum in your community with need. Until these infrastructure funds and other funding sources from the state roll out and allow us to serve other income brackets with rental housing, we're kind of stuck with the tax credit program as our primary way to provide rental housing. The little bit I've heard from community members about the low-income housing tax credit program in Taos is that it's been challenging because there's been out-of-area developers and they haven't followed through on commitments. So there is a way for
And the scale's big. You have to have minimum 60 units.
They're very technical programs.
50, 60. I mean, you can go lower, but it makes it really expensive. There's laws.
Yeah, but no, it's a federal program, but it's a federal that goes through the state. And let me just finish this real quick or I'll never remember it. I'm so sorry. But what the community could do is they could, with early capital, queue up a project and the developer and really harness what they want. A lot of times what happens in communities, developers come and you go, sure, that sounds great. We could flip it and go, you know what, we want a senior project on that corner and we want somebody who, right, has this reputation for those builds. Sorry. So anyway, there's a way to play with that. So that's why it's in the plan for a future in the next year or two to queue up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to say that when we do off-grid developments, not a penny is spent on infrastructure because each building takes care of itself. So all that money can be put into the buildings themselves, and then that also brings in tax-paying citizens that do not tax the infrastructure. So there's a lot of solutions there when you essentially go green or do a lot of those off-grid solutions.
Yeah.
And I think that might be the pathway to get into producing a lot of affordable housing.
Thank you.
And I could piggyback and just
Go for
say,
it.
some other things you could think about rental housing are looking at how easy it is to build smaller scale rental, right? There's some cool programs where local governments pay you to build a guest house if you make it available to someone who used to be homeless for a certain period of time, right? You as a community need to harness your creativity, right? There's lots of models out there, but they haven't all been done, right? Like earthships are off-grid housing are a strength in your community. You should harness those in your framework of affordable housing programs, right? Same with really thinking differently. Your needs are unique, your talents are unique, your capacities are unique in your community, and really do dream up creative stuff. And hopefully Taos Housing Partnership and the resources that are around are there to help bring those new ideas to the surface because it has to be innovative. What we've done for the last 30 years isn't working right now. So we have to do things differently. For sure.
This is when the hook comes out and goes, I'm taking you off. I'm going to use your mic really quick.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming tonight. Obviously, I'm just going to ask one question. Do we all get the complexity of this? Yes, please raise your hand. Did you learn something that you didn't know before you came in tonight? Yeah.
Great.
There's more work here to do, obviously. And the partnerships, to start addressing these complexities, whether or not it's the brainstorming ideas of what is the local expertise and the uniqueness that this community holds coming up, and working with our government partners and figuring out how all of that money flows, because the federal money and the state money and the philanthropic money is all different. So I want to thank everybody for coming. If you did not sign up, because I counted heads in here, which means there were people that did not sign up, and I know who you are, would you please sign up? It's really helpful to us as we move this work forward. Tomorrow night, 4 o'clock, we'll be at Town Council, a little bit different presentation, and then also Wednesday night, legislative debrief with Senator Gonzalez and Representative Ortez. That will also be at the town chambers. That one is at 6 o'clock, 5:30. Alexandra's going to run and check, 5:30. It's at 6. I thought we had a time change. 4 o'clock tomorrow. We've got flyers on the table. Please sign up to Taos Housing Partnership website, email. We're now getting into our mode of newsletter once a month. Thank you for the comments, because what we'll do is kind of go back and figure out how we disseminate more information, and certainly how we continue to work with our great partner at the governor's office. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We had a YouTube. We had a live stream. Yes.
I'm not going to try to pronounce his first name, but his last name is Bob.
His name's Efi.
Huh?
His name is Efi.
Okay. He said, what are the plans of the state government to incentivize the development of efficient green homes? How do we need to run this on longer? That could be a long question.
Yeah.
I'm passing it off. Repeat the question, please.
Right. So the question is about what the state is doing to incentivize the building of green homes. So I mentioned the Green Building Code. I mentioned the various solarization programs that are coming down. I think the Affordable Housing Agency, the Mortgage Finance Authority, has green building standards that all their new housing must meet. And then I think the big thing that we're looking at is also the bigger picture of efficiency, which is like making sure that we're building housing for workers near jobs, right? So making sure not just units are efficient, but they're put in the right places, because that's the part we get really wrong right now. And as Taos gets more expensive, the workers are getting pushed farther out, and they're driving further for the same jobs. And that has so many negative impacts beyond just the efficiency of housing. So. But yeah, those are the main ways. Green Code, aggressive energy retrofit programs for electrification, mini splits, solarization, things like that.
Great.
Thanks, YouTube.
Thanks, everybody.